Welcome to today's Sant Mat Satsang podcast edition of Spiritual Awakening Radio. My name is James Bean. Today I focus on the Murar Declaration, the historic Spircon 2010 interfaith Radhasoami event that took place, this historic event that took place in Agra, India. My guest is Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, author of a very wonderful book called Radhasoami Reality. We talk about the history of Sant Mat, the origins of this path, and especially about this gathering that took place back in 2010, this interfaith gathering. It's tempting to say a kind of Vatican II for Sant Mat. It's not quite a Vatican II for Sant Mat, but I'm tempted to say that because it was really an amazing historic development. This interview hasn't circulated too far and wide. Some followers of Dayalbagh shared copies, MP3s of this interview, and may remember me from a few years back when this interview first aired. But for the most part, many have not heard this program before, so I thought I would share it for the first time today. I dug deep into my archives, into my hard drive, and decided to just share this interview with this worldwide audience interested in satsang, in Sant Mat, in Radhasoami, in the meditation practice of inner light and sound, to share it with everyone here today. Before I get to the Mark Juergensmeyer interview, a little bit of background. First of all, a good word for academic books like Radhasoami Reality. When approaching a spiritual path, it's good to have objective publications from a non-sectarian point of view, to learn more, to get some background on a path. I have done with Sant Mat the same thing I did with Ekankar and Christianity, to poke around, to ask questions, to trace things back. Who was the master of the master? Who was his master? Who was that person's master? What are the primary spiritual texts? Where did these texts come from? Where does this path come from? It's good to get familiar with the path. And academic books written by people who aren't necessarily affiliated with any particular branch of it can provide vital information, alert you to any problems or ethical situations or red flags. They can also let you know about some wonderful books you should get. It's good to get those academic type books like Radhasoami Reality by Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, David Lane's book, The Making of a Spiritual Movement, David Lorenzen's In Praise of a Formless God, Daniel Gould's Lord as Guru, so many of those wonderful academic books. There's a great textbook with several contributors. Several scholars have contributed to a book called The Sants. That's an amazing book all about the history of the Sants of India, with chapters also exploring Sufism, and there's a Radhasoami section and sections devoted to the tradition of Kabir. It's absolutely priceless to have some academic books to call upon to get some honest answers, some objective information from non-sectarian points of view. A bit about the Murar Declaration that became the basis for this 2010 event that took place at Dayalbagh University in Agra. Remembering the Murar Declaration and the Interfaith Spircon 2010 historic event. The letter of invitation was sent to the revered leaders of 7 centers, and also the draft of proposed declaration, or the Murar Declaration, on the lines of the one adopted by Dayalbagh at Murar, was sent for consideration. Revered Baba Kehar Singh Ji Maharaj of Tarn Taran and revered Kanwar Singh Sahib of Dinod participated in the conclave. The revered leaders of Beas and Sawan Kirpal Rouhani Mission, Delhi, were going to be out of the country or out of India on the dates set for the conclave. Revered Baba Gurinder Singh Ji Maharaj of Beas promised to visit Dayalbagh before the end of the celebrations and did come on the 16th of March 2011. And I'm just skimming through this document I have. Sawan Kirpal Rouhani Mission conveyed full support for the Marar Declaration. Revered Agam Prasad Mathur Sahib of Pipal Mandi participated in the Spircon seminar as chief guest of honor and has indicated his support for the declaration, referring once again to the Marar Declaration. Mahantji of the Tulsi Mat of Hathras, or the Sant Tulsi Sahib Mandir or ashram based in Hathras, attended Spircon throughout. Also, the Dr. Hazra group affiliated with Swami Bagh attended Spircon 2010. The Marar Declaration, the basis of fellowship, the framework of this gathering. The following is the text of the declaration, which was signed by revered Dr. P.S. Satsangi Sahib, revered Baba Kehar Singh Sahib, and revered Kanwar Singh Ji of the Dinod Radhasoami Satsang. Radhaswami Dayal incarnated himself in the year 1818 in the form of Swamiji Maharaj in this world for the redemption of souls, or jivas. In 1861, he declared open his satsang to the public in general, which was an event of unparalleled mercy. By his grace, satsang has been making steady progress ever since. The Nij Dar has continued to function in different human forms continuously. We have the assurance that the Nij Dar will not return until it has completed its task of the redemption of all jivas, or souls. Point number 2. In due course of time, several centers of the Radhasoami Satsang have got established. It is with the strength of Nij Dar that the Sant Gurus of different centers are maintaining progress of their respective communities. 3. We are all pilgrims, treading the same path and desirous of reaching the same destination ultimately. Satsang movement has been started to spread the true religion and peace and tranquility in the world, and to draw people towards the holy feet of Huzur Radhasoami Dayal. This object can be better served by maintaining mutual affection and brotherly relations among the different centers of the Radhasoami Faith, and working in cooperation to attain the common goal, as the objective of worship of everyone is the same, i.e. merciful Radhaswami, and the original home of everyone is the same, i.e. the abode of Radhaswami. And the real teachers of everyone are the same, Bani and discourses of merciful Radhaswami. So obviously then, all should have brotherly relations and heartfelt love and affection for one another. That particular point was also a quote. That paragraph is by Huzur Maharaj Raisalagram Bahadur from the book Prem Patra Radhaswami. Point number 4. As satsang completes 150 years, it is the right time to take an initiative in this direction. We recognize all those belonging to the larger Radhaswami community who satisfy the following criteria. All recognize Param Parush Swamiji Maharaj as avatar of Radhasoami Dayal. B. Accept Radhaswami Nam as the true Nij Nam. And C. The practice of Surit Shad Yoga under the guidance of a living Sansat Guru as the way for attaining liberation. In order to strengthen the satsang movement for attainment of its goal, we make the following declaration. 1. That all satsang centers and the satsangis affiliated with them would maintain and promote brotherly relations and affectionate behavior towards the followers of the Radhasoami faith attached to different centers. 2. Each center will continue to make separate arrangements for satsang as it deems proper. It will be open to a satsangi to join any center according to his or her inclination and to follow the lead of the Sant Sat Guru, whose guidance he or she wants. 3. Each center will be free to manage its properties according to its wishes, but access to the shrines under their management will be provided to the followers of the faith attached to the different centers. 4. No satsangi by any written word or utterance will make any statements which may be derogatory to other satsangs or try to instill his or her ideas and feelings in the minds of others. We enjoin upon satsangis attached to the various centers to follow this declaration in letter and in spirit. So that's the essence of the Marar Declaration. And just a note for those in the West, for the benefit of some in the West, it should also be said, Surat Shabd Yoga in all of the above mentioned spiritual communities is taught to students at no cost. There is no charge, no money involved whatsoever in order to learn the practice. There are no membership fees or payments required for membership dues or monthly discourses. In order to qualify to learn the inner light and sound meditation practice known as Surat Shabd Yoga, one simply needs to be willing to learn from a living master, adhere to the lacto-vegetarian diet, and the other basic, universally recognized ahimsa principles taught in all of the above Sant Mat communities. My guest today is Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, author of the book Radhasoami Reality. During this conversation today, you'll hear all sorts of fascinating things about the history of this path. We explore the spirit of Sant Mat ecumenism and dialogue of the 2010 historic Spircon conference. Also some Sant Mat history speculation on the origins of the Radhasoami faith, the ashram of Tulsi Sahib, the Tulsi Sahib group in Hathras, the people of the Anurag Sagar, or what Mark Juergensmeyer calls Esoteric Santism. Esoteric Santism refers to the specific brand or type of Sant Mat that we find present in the teachings of Tulsi Sahib, the Radhasoami faith, and contemporary Sant Mat. And we explore the question as to who was teaching this esoteric Sant Mat prior to the time of Sant Tulsi Sahib of Hathras, and we trace it back in time. We talk about Sant Dariya Sahib and the Dharamdasi line of masters in the Kabir branch of Sant Mat. Mark Juergensmeyer is director at a Center of Global and International Studies. He's a professor of sociology and affiliate professor of religious studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is an expert on religious violence, conflict resolution, and South Asian religion and politics, and has published more than 200 articles and 20 books, including Radhasoami Reality, The Logic of a Modern Faith, published by Princeton University Press. Also, other projects include Songs of the Saints of India, Mystic Poetry of Kabir, Guru Nanak, Ravidas, Mirabai, Surdas, and Tulsi Das. That's from Oxford University Press. Contributed chapters to the Sants, Studies in a Devotional Tradition of India, a book published in India by Motilal Banarsidass Books of Delhi. We discuss the Spircon 2010 International Seminar on the Religion of Sants and the Radhasoami Faith, Spiritual Consciousness Studies, which was held at Dayalbagh University, associated with the Dayalbagh branch of the Radhasoami Faith. And we discuss other branches of Sant Mat which participated in that wonderful historic event, a kind of Vatican II of Sant Mat, a most unusual event. Welcome to Spiritual Awakening Radio and my interview with Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, author of the book Radhasoami Reality.
Today is Mark Juergensmeyer, author of the book Radhasoami Reality, contributor to the book also known as The Sants, on the Sant tradition of India. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure.
You recently attended the Spircon conference in, was it held in Agra?
It was held at the Dayalbagh branch of Radhasoami at the Dayalbagh Educational Institute. So technically, it was an academic conference sponsored by the university.
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, it sounded like a fascinating historic event. And recently I was reading a declaration that the Dayalbagh group made during the summer of 2010, suggesting sort of a framework for dialoguing with other branches of the Radhasoami Faith. So I'm most intrigued to find out about this conference and who attended and what was said.
Yeah, that occurred the day after my presentation and really following the formal conference. But there was a meeting of four spiritual masters in the Radhasoami tradition. And I think probably the first time something like this has happened since the council. There was an earlier attempt, when was it, 1930s or 40s?
Right, the 20s or 30s.
Yeah, to try to have some sort of coordination among the groups that never quite took off. But in this case, there were four representatives.
Who were the branches represented, or the?
Well, there was the Pipal Mandi branch, Agam Prasad Mathur, and that's Rai Setagam's home, and he's in that lineage. There was the Tarn Taran master, who's kind of split off from the Beas branch of Radhasoami. And then a new branch that has developed in the last 20 years, also in the Punjab. So these were not major branches, but I'm told that there was messages of support and agreement on the general principles, both from Beas and from Kirpal Ashram in Delhi. And those, of course, are the other two major branches of the Radhasoami tradition.
So those latter did not attend, but
they were traveling internationally.
Yeah, but they did send some kind of communication to us.
They said the regrets that they couldn't make it. They did support the general gist of the agreement. There were a number of points on which they agreed in that brief meeting, and I guess these were circulated in advance. And primarily, the points of agreement were to respect each other, to regard them, their followers, as fellow, Satsangis, to not try to compete for the loyalty of the followers, to respect the traditional sites, and to make any site of historical value available to all Satsangis in any branch of the tradition. Now, that last point may have been one of the major issues, because, as you know, across the street from Dayalbagh, there's another Radhasoami community, Swami Bagh, right. And that is, in fact, the original location of the Sadhu camp, where Swami Dayal Singh gave his sermons, and that's also the location of the Samat, or the tomb of Swami Dayal. And it's on that location that an enormous edifice is being constructed, a marble. It looks kind of like a cathedral with minarets, and it's about half completed, but it's a very slow, painstaking process.
And you didn't mention Swami Bagh as being one of those in attendance.
Interesting, isn't it?
Right. Because they do have some factions, I guess, that are affiliated with living teachers and could make that criteria, that list of the criteria mentioned in the declaration, reverence for Swamiji Maharaj, and the use of the sacred name Radhasoami, and the practice of Surat Shabd Yoga. And so they would make that list.
Yeah, that's true. But of course, not everybody in Swami Bagh recognizes that there are, living masters among their presence, and
right.
Officially, the stance of the group is that there's an interregnum in the spiritual line. Although one of the people that I interviewed, Maheshwari, was adamant that there could be a hidden master, and of course, was some of his own followers who declared after his death that he, in fact, was giving initiation and serving as a master to some people in a very kind of private way.
And his son also serves in that capacity.
So I understand.
Right. Interesting that Baba Kehar Singh of the Tarn Taran group was there.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I enjoy his writings. He has quite a few books in English, so I get to check his teachings out.
I see. There's been a close relationship between Bias and the Tarn Taran branch.
Right.
And from time to time, the masters of Tarn Taran have sat in the dais in Bias, and so there already is a kind of kindred relationship there.
So it sounds like this conference and the declaration is perhaps a continuing effort, perhaps with future plans to continue dialoguing between the different branches of Radhasoami?
That's certainly the sentiment of the current master, Professor P.S. Satsangi, who is now the master at Dayalbagh, who's a very gracious person and a very, I think, generous person, would like very much to, for the branches of the Radhasoami tradition to at least have a collaborative relationship.
Right, yeah, and they have some wonderful translations. The Dayalbagh group has some great English translations of Prem Patra Radhasoami, the Sar Bachan, and other writings. Very well done translations.
Yeah, that's true. They early on, Dayalbagh was kind of the leader in English translations, and then of course Bias has become a major source of English translations, as has the Kripal Ashram. The Dayalbagh Educational Institute is really quite an interesting thing. It is a separate individual university. That is, it's not purely for Satsangis. And it's a general education university, and it's in fact a deemed university. Deemed in India's educational parlance means it has a special appointment from the federal government. It's not under any state university. In the Indian university system, most colleges, which that is teach undergraduates, are under a single university. Like Delhi University has, 30, 40 different colleges that are under it, and maybe 100,000 students. I don't know how many are total, but they're all in their separate colleges, and the syllabuses are all set by a central university. In other states, if there are more than one university, there is some sort of head university relationship, but the federal government can anoint some universities to be deemed universities, which set their own curriculum, and this was the case with Dayalbagh. They were able to, this is early on when the 1940s, I guess it was established, to create it as a separate federally appointed university, which is really quite a distinction. But it means that they can set their own curriculum, and they've set a very interesting, very humanistic curriculum on culture and comparative religion, which they require all students to take, but also very heavy emphasis on the sciences. And recently they've gone very much into modern computer technology, and they're at the forefront of Indian universities doing work in computer science, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I hear good things about this colony, the Dayalbagh, or community, kind of a gigantic intentional community.
It is, but if you've gone to Beas, and especially if you've gone to Beas recently, which has really become kind of a mega city, well, maybe mega town would be more correct. I mean, but it's huge. And then you go to Dayalbagh, it's really, you think, oh wow, this is really a totally different experience. It's a sleepy, kind of colonial building-looking alternative, but that's deliberately kept that way. The big events, which the bandaras, which at Beas will attract, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, and they have the facilities to deal with all those people, tents for them to sleep, and enormous lungers for free food for everybody. At Dayalbagh, they have 4 or 5 of these a year, but the satsangis are allowed to only come to 1. So they very carefully try to regulate the size of the crowds, and then even then limit the numbers so that the place is not overwhelmed. So their approach is somewhat different than Beas in terms of dealing with the numbers of satsangis, and also the kind of impact on the central institution or central location. Have you been to Dayalbagh?
No, I haven't. No, I have not.
It's worth a stop. I mean, when you go to India, you have to go to Agra to see the Taj Mahal, right? So you certainly should go just up the road to see the 2 historic locations, Swami Bagh and Dayalbagh on either side. And while you're there, you could go and see the Pipal Mandi, the old location of Rai Salagam.
Right, Agam Prasad Mathur.
Where he is currently the master, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about some questions regarding ancient history or early history of Radhasoami Faith, and
of course that's one of the things I was interested in doing in my book, because nobody ever tried to do that, try to trace the origins of the ideas and the earlier precursors of the Swami Shiv Dayal Singh.
Yeah, in your book, Radhasoami Reality, you mention a trip to Hathras, to the Samad of Param Sant Tulsi Sahib, and meeting a Mahant there. Let's see his name. I've got it on my computer here.
Well, you probably have it closer in the tip of your tongue than I do.
Sant Prakash Das.
Sounds right, yeah.
And he's in this lineage of Sir Swami and Rama Krishna and some others that are apparently in a living lineage of teachers and a satsang of Tulsi Sahibis, I guess would be the name, or Tulsi Panth, Tulsi Sahib branch of Sant Mat in Hathras. And so apparently they're still there.
Not to be confused with the great Tulsi, who is the supposedly author of the Ramayana. And so this is the Tulsi Sahib of Hathras, which is a local lineage in this particular town, not too far from Agra.
Right, Tulsi Sahib as opposed to Tulsi Das.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you met this individual, and they have a group there. I've been waiting for them to put up a website, but they are one of the few groups related to the Sant tradition that I have not found a website for at this point. But I believe they're there, or someone is there, and apparently you met a Mahant and some followers there in Hathras.
Yes, and I haven't been back since, so I have no idea what the current state of the movement is. But in India's traditions, once you've established an ashram, these institutions usually live on, and the big issue is not their survival, but rather who is the anointed or proper person to be the successor when a previous master passes on.
And apparently, when you were there in the late 70s, or I guess it was around 79 or 80, in that period, they apparently had a group there, and I don't know if you have any recollections of what it was like to be there, or any impressions?
Yeah, no, I remember distinctly. It was a fairly small and fairly modest ashram. By ashram, I mean a meeting place for satsang, and residences for devotees or sadhus or people who are just in camp for a while for to receive the spiritual benefit of the presence and the teachings. But it was not a huge operation, and there was not, it was, how to describe it, like the size of a large house. It was more, our compound with a central courtyard and then several rooms and sort of adjacent buildings around it.
So not a large group, not a big. Not a big group.
No, really quite a modest ashram.
That would explain why they don't have a web presence or weren't the first to go internet. If it's a smaller group.
This may shock you, but not everybody in the world is quite as computer savvy as you and I may be.
Well, India has come a long way in the last few years.
Amazing. I remember when I was first living and traveling in India, when to make a telephone call was just a horrendous experience. You could more easily call the United States than you could call from one town to another in India. You'd have to place your call. You'd have to go to the post office, which had a room for making telephone calls, and then you'd have to book your call in advance, and then they would arrange the call and get the party on the other side, and then they would call you back. You'd be sitting there the whole time waiting,
right.
And finally to make your connection. Today, everybody has cell phones.
Right.
Everybody in India has. They're ridiculously cheap. Everybody has them. Everybody uses them. You see rickshaw wallers, driving along on their rickshaw with their cell phone in their left hand. It's just amazing.
They have leaped forward.
Well, if that's forward, but they've certainly leaped.
Indeed. And I also wanted to ask you about your research that very much pertains to the origins or the connection between earlier Sant traditions and Radhasoami. You've had some interesting reflections about the book known as the Anurag Sagar and the Dharamdasi Kabir Panth group.
Right.
And I guess you visited with the Dharamdasis and see in them a connection, perhaps, a similarity between them and the Radhasoami faith.
Well, this is all speculation, of course, and I don't dispute the kind of singular importance of Swami Shiv Dayal and his teachings, but there are echoes, there are resonances in earlier traditions, and so as a scholar, my curiosity is to try to put those connections together and see if there might be some earlier lineages or traditions from which that have a connection to the ideas and the teachings and the kind of movement, in fact, that Swami Shiv Dayal was able to develop and which has emerged into the Radhasoami faith. And the best I was able to connect it through the books that were important at Hathras and the importance of the Anurag Sagar, as you mentioned, were to the Dharamdasis, which is a movement really in some ways that if you go there, you think, oh, this is kind of a funny branch of Radhasoami. A little funny in that they're more kind of iconic Hindu representations there, more of an emphasis on sadhus, but a lot of the teachings and the style of satsang and so forth is really quite similar. And the Dharamdasis are in turn a kind of branch of Kabir Panth, and I think I describe it as esoteric Kabir Panthis because although they follow the teachings of Kabir, now Kabir is this medieval teacher or guru or saint or sant in the Indian tradition who is venerated by both Hindus and Muslims, and the name Kabir is Muslim, of course.
Right, one of the 99 names of God in Islam.
Exactly. But it said he was a convert or someone who venerated both Hinduism and Islam. And, of course, the common folk story in India is that after his death, the Hindus and Muslims fought over his body as to who would get it, whether it would be cremated as a Hindu or whether it be buried as a Muslim. And, of course, a miracle occurred on the spot. Poof, his body turned into a huge pile of flowers, and there were enough for both so that the Hindus could take their batch of flowers off and cremate it, and the Muslims could take their batch of flowers off and bury it as a Muslim. But Kabir is often, I won't hold to the veracity of that story, but that's the story that's told. But it does show that he's, in the Indian imagination, somebody who is kind of crosses over those two great religious traditions.
And in death, in death, that story illustrates what he was in life, someone who reconciled Hindus and Muslims and was someplace between those two.
Some way between those two, but he was not a reconciling person. If you read his poetry, it is acerbic, it's biting. He has no use for religious pretense. He has no use for priests and all of the highfalutin stuff of religion. He says you just have to get right with God. And unless you have God in your heart, unless he's inside, he's nowhere. And he's just ruthless in making fun of spiritual pomposity. So, I mean, he's great to read. It's he's challenging. He has these short, punchy, poems with a kind of twist at the end. I have Jack Hawley and I have translated a lot of the Sant poetry, including Kabir, in our book Song of the Saints of India. And we had great fun with Kabir because he really is a kind of modern poet in the sense that he's, honest, direct, forthright. So it's interesting that at least some branch of the followers have seen a kind of mystic Kabir, and that they imagine that there's a kind of Kabir force that it lives on a different plane and then can be contacted only through kind of sound connections and then comes back to Earth in the form of living masters. And you can see in that idea already some of the ideas that are part of the Radhasoami tradition.
Yeah, and the Dharamdasi group, as well as Dariya Sahib of Bihar. Dariya seems to be in that Kabir, Anurag Sagar tradition, or Esoteric Santism, as you call it.
Right, and then there's the influence of not yogis, which are a very interesting group, and they're kind of a shadow figure behind a lot of things. And the very fact that some teachers are very adamantly opposed to the not yogis, then Sikhism, for example, they're very hostile to the not yogis. But the very fact that they express that kind of, hostility shows that they are aware of them and that they had an influence on them, and you can see some of those influences in Sikhism and arguably also in the Radhasoami tradition and other modern traditions of India.
Yeah, it is true that some of the terminology, including the word shabd, I believe, was used by the not yogis.
Right. And then there's, of course, the Buddhist connection. Because when you go to Gorakhnath in India, which is kind of the headquarters of the not yogis, you see figures of founding figures in the not yogi tradition and the kind of veneration that immediately strike you as being terribly Buddhist. And there is a kind of Buddhist sensibility of the unknowing God or the God beyond God, and the kind of quest within, which really distinguished heterodox Buddhism from Orthodox Hinduism, over 2,000 years ago. And the common sense idea is that Buddhism died out in India and then went to other parts of Asia, but somehow that never made sense to me that ideas and teachings would die out. I think it's probably more likely that they were simply absorbed and redirected and continued in other traditions, and maybe the not yogi tradition, and to some extent modern traditions like Radhasoami, helped to embody some of those original Buddhist sensibilities.
It is true that Sants such as Nam Dev use the term nirvana or nirvan pad to refer to that formless state, and one does think of Buddhism when you talk about that formless, nameless state.
Right. Mm-hmm. But all this is speculation. I mean, I'm not, that's the fun of historical scholarship. You're just trying to put connections together, and you're never quite certain that you know how it all worked out. But it is intriguing, and it's interesting to speculate about.
Same with Tulsi Sahib. It's only the internal evidence of the writings that supply clues. Like, for instance, Tulsi Sahib said he had a guru, but the guru is not named in any of the writings that have survived. But the fact that he used the Anurag Sagar, which is a Dharamdasi holy book not used by other Kabir Panths, could lead one to think that he must have hung out with them, or that there's a connection somehow between Tulsi Sahib and the Dharamdasis.
Certainly possible. Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like if there's this Christian sect, and they're not Mormon, but they use the Book of Mormon,
right? And
only Mormons use the Book of Mormon, or that's where it came from,
right?
Then you must imagine there's some connection there between this group and the Mormons.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sometimes it's an indirect connection, and sometimes, there may be other influences also of which we're not aware, but still it's intriguing to speculate about these connections.
Yeah, my theory is that Tulsi Sahib's guru was someone in the Panth of Dariya Sahib, one of several possible successors of Dariya Sahib, and that group also reveres the Anurag Sagar, and so it seems that Dariya Sahib and Tulsi were the closest. They were sort of soulmates.
Right.
And so it's possible.
Yeah. It'd be interesting. The question is, how would you find out? As I said, I've been to Hathras, and I've talked with people, and my Hindi isn't perfect, but at least it's functional, and I go with people who can help me with my Hindi, who are setting themselves Indian. But, the modern-day people at these ashrams don't necessarily have the history, certainly not in their head, and they so often they don't know, or they don't want to speculate, or they come up with connections you think are really implausible. So trying to trace this information down is not easy.
It's not easy, even like a generation or so after a guru in question. It's totally lost. The history is lost practically.
Sure, it's just lost or reshaped or re-remembered in ways that they're more convenient for or supportive of present-day people or factions, and that's just human. That's not to say that they're trying purposely to distort things, but it does make the task of historian that much more difficult.
Yes, I was looking at the list of gurus in the Dharamdas branch, and Sant Dharamdas's son took over as guru, I think it was like 1604, and Kabir supposedly passed on in 1520. Anyway, I was noticing this huge gap, as if Dharamdas had to be a guru for about a century before his son could take over after his death. And it seemed like an awfully big gap between Kabir and Dharamdas's son, unless the math is wrong somewhere, the dates.
Yes, or unless Dharamdas wasn't in fact around during Kabir's own lifetime.
Right.
Which is also quite possible, because these teachings are really, the Dharamdasi kind of twist on Kabir really is it sounds distinctly different than what we hear from the Kabir poetry, which is less mystical. It's certainly devotional. Kabir's emphasis on the inner Ram, the inner God, and taking God within. But there's no sense of the mysterious form of Kabir, and all these are later. So it wouldn't surprise me that if Dharamdasi was significantly later than the lifetime of Kabir.
Yes, the literature, it's beautiful literature and teachings, but it does remind me of Gnostic Gospels. In other words, a couple of centuries after the time of Jesus, this Gnostic mysticism evolved, and so you get a very esoteric, mystical path, and it really has to be later. It has to be based on something earlier. And so that kind of dates it a century or two.
Of Christian teachings also. I mean, the Gospel of John, which is the Gnostic Gospel, is by far the latest, the four Gospels to be written, probably around 120. So, 100 years after Jesus' death, and clearly influenced by Greek ideas of Gnosticism and Zoroastrian images of kind of formless logos, the word floating in space. The very beginning of the Gospel of John describes the birth of Jesus or the appearance of Jesus as being zapped. The logos, comes out from space and takes flesh, which is quite a different image than you find anywhere else in any of the other Gospels of the New Testament.
Yeah, it's a tradition a little later that's had time to develop and become eloquent, and that's very appealing to people. In the same way that the Anurag Sagar is a summing up of the tradition, with the four yugas of Kabir incarnating and so on. So it's kind of a summing up of a tradition that has been in development for a while.
The Anurag Sagar is still venerated in some branches of the Radhasoami tradition. I think, is it the Kabir ashram that has, it's some branch of the Kabir ashram people have put out a version of the Anurags. Maybe the Sant Bani group, am I?
Yes, Sant Bani ashram, to their credit, published it in English.
Right.
Which was a very nice thing. And the Tarn Taran group also has an English translation and commentary these days, a newer translation.
I see. I didn't know that. It's good.
Yes, a 3-volume set with commentary by Baba Kehar Singh.
Right.
And so that has become a second English edition. And there may be others published by somebody in India, some other group possibly. Yeah, it's a beautiful book. And but I do agree that it was written later in the tradition. And apparently there's a whole series of other volumes that we in the English reading world aren't so privy to. But I believe it's called The Ocean of Kabir. Or Kabir Sagar.
Kabir Sagar, yeah.
Yeah, and so this Anurag Sagar would be a volume in another in this whole literature, this whole world of Kabir literature.
Right.
Yeah. So it's fascinating to try and connect Tulsi Sahib to an earlier Sant tradition, and therefore kind of find out where your spiritual path came from. It's that desire to learn the family tree, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, on the other hand, I know there are people who just don't care. I mean, as far as they're concerned, the teachings of the master to which they are connected is the important thing, and I can understand that point of view also. So it takes a certain kind of, intellectual curiosity to want to kind of sleuth down these interesting connections.
Right, yeah. On the one hand, for some, it might not seem to lend itself to the devotional spirit and doing your meditation.
Right.
On the other hand, it's a way to get a handle on who's who in the world of gurus and to figure out, Ekankar, Master Path, Radhaswami, kind of come to terms with where these groups came from, and in a sense of trying to find legitimate connections, bona fide connections. And so it can have a cloak and dagger kind of dimension to it.
Right. But there is a family tree, and as you say, it's really interesting and significant that within the last couple of weeks, there have been attempts to try to not bring the tree together, but at least recognize the commonalities and to recognize the family relationships and respect those differences. And I thought that the respectful part was something that that impressed me quite a bit. The sense that each of the movements would not compete or disrespect the others, but to say, well, we're all in the same family tradition, and there may be different masters and different lineages, but we all have some fundamental things in common, and we should respect each other.
Yeah, that's a very refreshing. I was very pleased to read about this Spircon conference and the declaration that the Dayalbagh group made, kind of setting out basic criteria about who they might want to be in dialogue with, different branches of Radhasoami. So that was a very refreshing development, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, there have been, for years there was a lawsuit going back and forth across the street between Swami Bagh and Dayalbagh over precisely the issue of access to the holy shrines, and the question of whether Swami Bagh owned the samad of Shiv Dayal Singh, and that lawsuit, in a sense, was went on the Swami Bagh side, that it was their property. So, in a sense, this is an attempt to try to renew in a less legalistic way that the notion of shared access. And it's funny, you'd think it would make sense to Swami Bagh, because they need the money to try to finish that huge edifice, that if they were more open and accepting, kind of the way Saudi Arabia is open to all Muslims to come to the Hajj, they could probably get financial support from a wide range of satsangis that would make it possible to complete that project much more in a much more timely manner. But I won't speculate on what they're thinking or what they will do as a result of this, but I think now that it's kind of up to them to how they will respond to this kind of attempt to be collaborative and to be open.
Right, and I don't know if they all speak with one voice or if it's several factions in the same location.
Well, there are several factions, but they do have a council that meets, so there is like a governing council for the property of Swami Bagh, the town, and so there is legally a committee that makes decisions regarding issues such as this. So they do have a mechanism for doing that.
Yeah, hopefully they'll be coming to terms with some sort of dialogue with other groups. I think of Sants as belonging to all humanity and all mystics too. Jesus Meister Eckhart, Guru Nanak, Swamiji. They're for the whole human race and not really copywritten or trademarked by anyone in particular.
Yeah, the Swami Bagh is in a little bit of a kind of sensitive spot, though, because since they have declared an interregnum, they're the only branch of the Radhasoami tradition that does not have a single recognized spiritual master, although, as you say, there are several people within Swami Bagh who are recognized by a small following. There is no single central recognized master. So really the only thing they have is the past. The only thing that they have that unites them all and gives them a position of prominence within the Radhasoami tradition is their stewardship over the original garden and the samad of Swami Shiv Dayal Singh. So I guess that explains their, in a sense, possessiveness over that spot.
I was glad that I believe it was Sant Das Maheshwari that published all of those writings in English.
Right.
And the Sarbachan poetry and Prem Patra Radhasoami, all that literature, kind of on an unusual scale, 60 volumes or more.
Oh, he's a very interesting guy. Of course, he's passed on now, but very enterprising, very you could see that he was a man with a mission, and very smart and very. You could also see that he would be a person whom not everybody would admire. I mean, he came on kind of strong, and certainly had his strong opinions, but he was very bright, and at times could be argumentative.
But a good translator.
But a good translator. Also, he had a collection of some of the relics from the original master, fingernail clippings and that sort of thing. And I assume they are now with his son.
And there's one question that some have, I think, in some branches of the Sant tradition about the name Radhasoami. In the original Sarbachan poetry, some have suggested that the name Radhasoami wasn't there, but another name, and then Salagram, when he came out with his version, added the name Radhasoami.
Right.
But I've heard other people say, no, there are handwritten copies of each of those poems by Swamiji, and the name Radhasoami is in there right in the original manuscript.
Yeah, I've simply, in my book, I simply reported on the two perspectives, and I have not made an attempt to try to make that determination, whether it was what part of the Sarbachan prose and poetry are original and what was interpolation from Rai Salagram, or that's the scholarly task that somebody might want to pick up. If you want to do your PhD dissertation on that topic, I'd be proud to sponsor it. But I simply reported that there is, this kind of discussion about whether, in fact, it was a part of the original teachings, and I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's a word with overwhelming usage in the Sarbachan poetry, and does turn up in the prose a little bit as well, and so there are it would be an awful lot of interpolations if it was an interpolation. Right.
Yes, my assumption is that the phrase Radhasoami would be not uncommon, meaning, literally the Lord of Radha, or, another name for Krishna, and particularly in that region, which is Krishna's homeland. Vrindavan, Krishna's pilgrimage center, is right next to the town of Mathur, which is right close to Agra. So it would not be surprising to find that term used for a name for God in other contexts. What is unusual, of course, is for it to be used in this way, not for an iconic God, not for specifically, Krishna or an avatar of Ram, but on a kind of God consciousness. That is, of course, striking, and how that connection is made. I don't know. I can only imagine.
Yeah, it's a very bhakti or devotional type practice of repeating the name Radhasoami, but yes, referring to Narguna or formless,
right?
Formless God.
Right, because it is very much a part of Sagana practice, which is the form, devotion to a form God, as opposed to Nirguna, which is, devotion to a God you can't see, can't know, or only experience within. But if you go to Vrindavan, the Krishna pilgrimage center, their common expression when you go to the town is Radha, Radha, hey Radha. So in fact, it's Radha that is the female form of Krishna, the consort of Krishna, that is kind of the main term that's used in the town, even though it's Krishna's town, which is really interesting. And that says two things. One is that to be able to be a devotee of Krishna, you have to be like Radha, his consort, but then it also means that the purest expression of that relationship is love, the love that lovers have, and the love that devotees have for their masters. So
right, bhakti, lover and the beloved.
Lover and the beloved. So that certainly is the dominant religious motif of that region. And it's, of course, interesting that this area of Agra is very close to that region.
Yeah, that context certainly makes sense. And usually you can see down the middle. There are different approaches. Like there's the Panch Nam, the 5-name tradition, and probably earlier that was Swamiji's approach, and then later you have the innovation of Radhasoami Nam, and some favor the former, others favor the latter. Both claim historic legitimacy, and both are right.
Yes, I mean that's actually my value of doing this, being an outsider and the scholar, is that I don't have to decide which is right. I can simply report on the diversity and how it's admired and appreciated and respected within all branches of the tradition.
Yeah, and academic books, big picture, multi-tradition books are so valuable. Of course, David Lane's writings, your book, Radhaswami Reality, the Sants, Agam Prasad Mathur's book on the Radhasoami Faith, a historic study. Those big picture, multi-lineage views are, I think, very helpful.
Thanks. The other two scholars I know, of course, who have worked on Radhasoami tradition is Dan Gold, the Lord is Guru, and his focus is actually on the Radhasoami Master in Gwalior, which is not one of the better-known branches of the tradition, but it's the one to which he was introduced and had access, and then talks about the Radhasoami tradition more generally from that point of view. Dan was also at the Spircon conference, by the way. He teaches at Cornell. And then Lawrence Babb, who's at Amherst, has one section on Radhasoami in his book. Oh, shoot, what's the name of the book? Think of it in a second. Probably have it in my bibliography, my own book. And then there's a psychologist who's written on Lawrence Babb's book is Redemptive Encounters, three styles in the Hindu tradition. And then there's a psychologist who's in India, who has a section on the reverence to the Guru, but Sudhir Kakar. And Kakar's a terrific guy. He is himself a Punjabi and knows the Bias area fairly well. But he is a psychologist, so he talks about, the infantilizing role that the devotee that takes in relationship to the master. And if you're a devotee, you might be put off by some of this kind of psychologizing of the relationship, but it is interesting.
And
his is in, I think, in Shamans, Mystics, and Doctors is his book.
Oh, yes.
And The Path of the Saints is the chapter in that book. And those are the main. You've talked about David Lane's work.
There is David Lorenzen, who's researched Kabir Panth.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's several people who've worked. He's done specifically in the Kabir Panth, and then on Kabir's writings, people like Linda Hess and
Charlotte Vaudeville.
Yes, Charlotte Vaudeville is one of the early writers on Kabir. I'm trying to think who else. But there's reference to this in the Song of the Saints of India book that Jack Hawley and I edited.
And that's published by SUNY Press, New York?
Our book is Oxford.
Oxford, good to know, because I know there's another one published by SUNY Press. That's the Nirmal Das Songs of Kabir and the Adi Granth, I guess I'm thinking of.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But yours is, what's the title again?
Songs of the Saints of India.
Songs of the Saints of India.
And it's meant to be a kind of general introduction for everybody, layman. It's used a lot in introductory textbooks in Hinduism. I'm really pleased to say that it still has a life. When you do a book years ago, you wonder how long it's going to last. But it's just come out in a new edition in India, as well as a new edition in the United States, both by Oxford University Press, Songs of the Saints of India. And the saints are Kabir, about whom we've just been speaking, but also Tulsi Das, Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh tradition, Sur, the blind saint, and
Surdas,
and Mirabai, the woman. So the interesting thing about the Sant tradition is that, with the exception of Tulsi Das, none of them are Brahmins. And in fact, in Kabir's case, he's really hostile to Brahmins. He sees them as very pretentious people. But there are also people who, handicapped people like Sur, and particularly people who are blind. That's in controversy because darshan, as you know, is such an important thing in the Hindu tradition in general. It's important in Radhasoami to actually take in the master through the eyes.
Right.
And if you're blind, how can you do that? But Sur, who is blind, writes eloquently about seeing the God within, and that the true sight is not the one that's the physical with the eyes. Is the true sight is the internal discovery, and that's one of the things that makes him so powerful. And of course, Mira is a woman, and in India in general, women are not thought to be as accomplished in spiritual matters as men, but of course she shows them that the power of Mira is that she's able to show that her gender is not only is a handicapped, it's a way of entering into even a higher form of devotion with God.
Oh yes, anyone could publish a book of female Sants of India, Dayalbagh, Mirabai.
Yeah.
There are several. I think I researched that and came up with like 15 female saints, and I'm sure there's many more than that.
Yes, and they continue. I mean, there's many lineages that have female masters. That hasn't been the case within the Radhasoami tradition, interestingly.
But at least not lately.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, some people say that Mataji, the wife of the Shiv Dayal Singh, had the power to initiate.
Right. And later on, Babuji Maharaja's sister.
That's right. But in both of those cases, it was not clear whether everybody accepted that, and it was certainly not a dominant role within the tradition.
And in a patriarchal society, they would just initiate females, not men, right?
Right. Yes, but I don't see any reason why. I don't see anything in the logic of the Radhasoami tradition that would prohibit the understanding that the line of spiritual masterhood went to a woman. As you know, the determination of that really is from the followers, whether they see the line continuing in a particular person or not, and that's of course why there's often a division after the death of a previous master.
Yeah, and there are two females I know that are serving in the capacity of Satguru. Yogani Mataji, assuming she's still alive, she would be getting up there in years by now, in the Baba Fakir Chand tradition. If she's still out there in northern India somewhere.
That's a good point, because I knew Fakir Chand, but hadn't really followed up since his passing.
Yeah, and then there is a disciple of Sant Kirpal Singh that has an ashram in Delhi, and is even on good terms with Science of Spirituality and other branches of Kirpal Singh, Ruhani Satsang.
Right. Yeah. So it's certainly possible, and it has happened.
Yes, indeed. Well, this has been great speaking with you today about the Sant tradition and Radhasoami and this very positive development with the Spircon, the conference at Dayalbagh. And once again, who were the groups attending the Dayalbagh conference? Was the Baba Fakir Chand group included in that?
No. I don't know whether they were invited and couldn't make it. I don't know the invitation list. It was from Pipal Mandi and from Taran Taran and the other group the new group in Punjab.
I'm curious as to who that might be.
Well, I have it in my notes someplace.
As you mentioned, it's a newer group.
Hang on. Hold for just a second. Let me check my files.
Okay.
Well, I don't see my files immediately, but it's one of these things where as soon as we stop talking, it'll come to me, and I'll say, "Oh, darn it! I should have mentioned the name." My apologies.
The name of the female guru in Delhi that was a disciple of Sawan Singh and Kirpal Singh is Sant Chandar Prabhajji, if I'm pronouncing that somewhat correctly. And Yogani Mataji was the female successor, or one of the initiating gurus after Baba Fakir Chand and the Hoshiarpur Radhasoami Satsang.
Right.
So the Spircon conference, Dayalbagh, someone from Radhasoami Beas group they were invited, or they...
I'm told that messages of support and conviviality came from both Tripal Ashram and from Beas.
Yeah. Yeah, and the Tarn Taran group.
They were represented. They were there.
Oh, that is such a refreshing development. Ecumenism, if you will.
Well, it was nice for me to see the respect that was given because the master, whose name I can't think of, from Punjab, came. This is the morning after the conference, and actually the morning before the meeting of the different movements. Every morning at Dayalbagh, they have this practice, as they do at Beas and other places, of having group seva. Servers working out in the fields, or working out in the case of Beas, trying to build a dam or to extend the land along the riverbank. But in the case of Dayalbagh, it's often they have these huge agricultural plots. It's working out in the fields. So they all went out in the fields to work on digging up peanuts, groundnuts, from the fields. And there were the masters of these traditions on their knees digging away at the peanuts. They weren't just sitting there; they were actually a part of the community at work. And it was very touching to see this kind of equality and everybody working together. And of course, there'd be great reverence of their followers to them, but they were all sharing together in that common experience. And it was very nice to see.
That would make a great DVD.
It would.
Wonderful. Was there
pleasure to talk with you?
Yeah. Was there plans announced at the first conference of having another one, or making it an annual event, or a future follow-up to create a new council of some sort?
I don't know. I, of course, wasn't at the meeting. I think that really depends on the organizers and the response, and whether they feel there's a need for it. But there was certainly an air of good feeling and conviviality, and I wouldn't be surprised if there'd be other occasions like this again in the future.
Right, it sounds like that. So that's always a good thing. Ahimsa, positive relations between different sects, is always a great thing.
Absolutely. Great.
If people want to email you, how is it best to do that?
Juergens, the first half of my last name, Juergens at global.ucsb.edu. We have a new global studies program at the University of California, Santa Barbara, which I'm a part, and the director of the Orfla Center for Global and International Studies. As you probably know, my interest in religion and society has taken a different twist in the last several decades with the rise of religious violence and religious nationalism around the world, and that's consuming a lot of my attention. So it's something of a relief to be able to talk about the more peaceful and spiritual aspects of religion and return to my work on Radhasoami.
The world needs more meditators and more Sufis, too.
Exactly.
Sufis, Quakers, and meditators.
Yep.
Instead of fundamentalist.
That's the kind of religion I like, and I think the world needs more of.
Less jihad and more love and meditation.
Absolutely.
Indeed. Well, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Good talking with you.
Radhasoami.
Radhasoami.
Professor Mark Juergensmeyer, Director of the Orfila Center for Global and International Studies, Professor of Sociology, and Affiliate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, author of the book Radhasoami Reality. Other publications include Songs of the Saints of India, Mystic Poetry of Kabir, Guru Nanak, Ravidas, Mirabai, Surdas, and Tulsi Das. If you Google his name, you'll find that he has a web page, a Wikipedia entry. You'll see links to various publications at Amazon and elsewhere, and more about Professor Mark Juergensmeyer and his various activities, his history, and projects over the years. By the way, the guru that we could not remember during the latter part of the interview was Sant Kanwar Singh of the Radhasoami Satsang Dinod. My name is James Bean. This Sant Mat Satsang podcast, this broadcast of Spiritual Awakening Radio, is a satsang service heard every week at this time. Please like and subscribe to this channel. If you have suggestions for future shows, or would like to ask a question or get in touch with me, send me an email at this address, james@spiritualawakeningradio.com. james@spiritualawakeningradio.com. Visit my website, spiritualawakeningradio.com. From there you'll see many links, tabs, and buttons that will take you to various sites for podcasts on demand, daily spiritual quotes, blogs, newsletters, articles, all to be found at the website, spiritualawakeningradio.com. Thanks for joining me. Let's do this again a few days from now. Tune in for the next Sant Mat Satsang podcast coming soon.